idea is like to explore like the idea of play and what led to like Adventure Playground and the ideas behind it, and like so that's sort of like that. So that's the question. So hopefully,
And I'm, if you have the bandwidth, and there's kind of there are eras of playground development that happens in New York City, and one of my theses has been that New York City has always been a bellwether for parks and recreation invention, creating the new models. And I can give you some of those examples. Like the very first purpose-built playground, public playground in America is here on the Lower East Side. Seward Playground, 1902 or 1904. And that came out of a public-private partnership. And that was the very first time there was a standalone playground for kids to play in, and so they weren't playing in the streets or in the docks. And it was created by sort of settlement houses and social workers to give a safe place for poor immigrant children to play. And then the evolution of that at scale in the WPA with Robert Moses, there was a 600% increase in playgrounds under his leadership in New York City. And then the sort of the adventure playgrounds are kind of a reaction to the Moses cookie cutter playgrounds with the monkey bars and the slides and the seesaws and sandboxes. So.
okay, so we'll just this is the only question that's going to be the same as any question I asked you last time. So it's just like what your name and who you are.
Yeah.
Just because I like to do it that way.
Okay, look at you.
You can look at me at the camera. It's basically the same thing.
Okay. I'm Adrian Benepe, and I'm president and CEO of Brooklyn Botanic Garden.
Okay, and can you discuss your playground experience as a kid growing up in Manhattan?
Yeah, so I literally grew up in playgrounds. And lots of playgrounds, but there was one playground in particular, which is still functioning today, and that was what's known now as the Dinosaur Playground in Riverside Park. And I was there in the, say, early to mid 60s, early to mid 1960s. And what I didn't realize then was it was exactly 30 years old when I was playing there. So it wasn't old, but it was magnificent. It's one of the greatest playgrounds in New York City in terms of a traditional WPA playground. And what makes it really spectacular is it's quite theatrical. It's at 2 levels, and it has a sort of ornate stone park house that hasn't been renovated since it opened in 1937. But this playground was just a classic Moses era playground. It had, but a high-end Moses era playground, WPA. It had a large, what we call now a spray shower. Some people call them splash pads now for the high-tech version. We called them sprinklers when we were kids. So it's got an oval spray shower area at a lower level. An upper level, it's got kind of like a terrace and a stone veneer-clad park house with men's and women's comfort stations, park office. Then you go down sort of grand, sort of shallow staircase to a lower level, which at the time had the spray shower area, 2 small sandboxes, really for toddlers, very small sort of rectangular sandboxes. And it had monkey bars, tall pipe structures of monkey bars. Seesaws, those big seesaws you go back up and down. Swings, both larger swings and smaller sort of metal box swings. And slides, just standard metal slides. And that was our playground. And that's what I and my sister would go play there every day after school. In those days, believe it or not, kids who were 7 or 8 years old could go to the playground alone, and we did. And when it was time to come home, my mother would lean out the window of our apartment in Riverside Drive and yell for us to come home. And her piercing voice would carry clear into the playground, and we'd go home. In those days, every playground still had a playground attendant of some kind, and even some vestiges of the Moses era with what they call a park matron, a woman who was in charge of, like, say, the women's room. And so they had people who were in charge of making sure that the restrooms are clean and safe. And there would be a matron there to make sure, in particular, the girls were safe. And there might be some kind of a recreation staff, or in the summer they'd bring out knock hockey boards and other games for kids. And then there'd be like a park attendant. And my recollection about them was they didn't do very much work. But by the mid-1960s, the Parks Department was very stultified and people just didn't work. And I'm pretty sure in hindsight that the main park keeper there was drunk.
Mm-hmm.
He used to come out and yell at us if we were doing things that were wrong. But there were people watching out for the kids. Every playground that had a park house in it had staff there. And it wasn't like today where you have locked up buildings and playgrounds that are not attended. So
do you rely on the parents to be that safety net in that playground?
you do now, and in those days, a lot of kids came without their parents. It was kids playing with each other, not necessarily parents. Now, if you go to the same playground, now it's known as Dinosaur Playground because when I was Manhattan Parks Commissioner, actually a little bit before that, in the 80s, we commissioned an artist to make some fiberglass dinosaur play sculptures that you could climb on. And from then on, it became known as Dinosaur Playground in the neighborhood. And the playground just to the south of it, which is also of the same era, 1937. A later renovation added some play structures that were in the shape of hippos.
Hippo playground.
And that's hippo playgrounds. So you've got Dinosaur Playground and Hippo Playground. Those are new versions of the old playground model.
And like a lot of those ended up where like classic playground. Some of those that's what
Classic Playground is called Classic Playground because it's a pretty much virtually unchanged circa 1937 playground. Mm-hmm. It was named Classic Playground by Henry Stern because of that fact that you had this kind of time machine back into the old style playgrounds. And the only concession to modern playground design was that underneath the playground they added the rubber safety matting. So you still have the monkey bars, but there's safety matting under. When I was a kid growing up, there was no safety matting. If you fell off the monkey bars, if you fell far enough, you'd break your arm.
Yeah, I don't know of any other park that has like a seesaw still.
Yeah, they've got seesaws, slides, monkey bars, and they've got the big oval water feature. So that's one of the great WPA playgrounds, still excellent, and it really is a time machine, and it should have greater appreciation for the fact that you can really go back in time to the summer of 1937.
Yeah, I agree with you. Like it is like a time capsule. But like with that, like the buildings there as well. Do you know like I guess they're like used like the maintenance kind of buildings. Also, do you know the architect was who built that?
So all of the architecture and landscape architecture in Riverside Park was designed under the Parks Department. They were Parks Department landscape architects, but they were supervised by Amar Embry II, who was the chief consulting architect. And then for landscape architecture, I have to think about this. I'm going to just pause for a second. Yeah, so Classic Playground is a combination of the architecture of Amar Embry II and two landscape architects, Gilmore Clark, who's the lead consulting landscape architect for the Parks Department in the WPA, and Clinton Lloyd. The three principal landscape architects for parks and playgrounds during the WPA were Gilmore Clark, Clinton Lloyd, and Mike Rapuano. And Clark and Rapuano formed a firm called Clark and Rapuano.
And do you have any recollection of like the Noguchi Con playground that was to be built there?
Yeah, there was a plan that was never executed. There was a plan for around the south end of the Esplanade in Riverside Park. That was never executed for a Noguchi playground.
But you were as a kid, were you aware of that?
No, it was just because it never got built. It was a plan that never got executed.
But there was a controversy in the community there.
Yeah, I was too young to have known about the controversy.
And what about like with like how much you were probably a baby, or maybe you weren't even born yet, but like with like the Battle for Central Park.
So the Battle for Central Park did happen when I was shortly after I was born, but it continued really into what sort of evolved. So first you had the battle to prevent the destruction of playgrounds that were slated to be demolished for a parking lot for Tavern on the Green. And I believe that one of the playgrounds did in fact go under for that parking lot, but they were able to save, not specifically that playground, but they added an adventure playground just north of Tavern on the Green as kind of a give back for the space they had taken away for the Tavern on the Green parking lot. So by the time I was, say, 8 to 10 years old, was the beginning of the sort of the adventure playground movement.
Do you remember? You must remember when Adventure Playground opened, And when and going there for the first time.
Well, I remember going particularly to the Wild West playground, which was similar vernacular. So you had two landscape architects more or less simultaneously working on this sort of new concept of playground. So New York City playgrounds really have 5 eras, from my point of view. First is the sort of privately constructed playgrounds done by social workers on the Lower East Side. So when you had social workers in settlement houses taking care of the needs of poor immigrants on the Lower East Side, not only did they have settlement houses, but they proposed this idea of we need safe places for children to play. Because children were playing in the streets, and they're being run over by street cars and horse carriages. They were playing on the docks, and they were drowning in the rivers. They're being told, hey, get out of the street, kid, you're messing up. So there's no safe place for kids to play in the tenement slums of Lower East Side. So the very first public playground that was created was part of a public-private partnership. And I believe Charles Stover may have been part of that. And they created a new model of a safe play space dedicated just to kids. And it had a large sort of open-air roofed pavilion, so you could be in the shade and out of the sun. It had very tall climbing structures and very big swings, probably incredibly dangerous. I'm pretty sure they had a dirt surface, so it was neither asphalt. They certainly didn't have rubberized things. They had things to slide around on, and they had slides and swings, but they're big and quite adventurous. So in some ways, you had adventure playgrounds at the very beginning of the playground movement, and then later on, those first initial models of playgrounds took on a life of their own. By the late 1920s, early 1930s, there were about 100 playgrounds in parks across New York City. And then when Robert Moses became Parks Commissioner in January of 1934, he put the playground movement on steroids and built hundreds of playgrounds. So we went from 100 playgrounds in 1934 to 600 by 1936 or 37. So a 6-fold increase in playgrounds literally overnight, because famously Moses had 2,000 architects and engineers and construction supervisors working 24/7. They had cots set up in the arsenal in room 200. And they had continuous shifts of architects and landscape architects working under the direction of Amar Embry and Gilmore Clark.
You wouldn't even had the playground to tear down for the Tavern of the Green if he didn't build it in the first place.
Yes, yeah, and he built them all over the place. And by the late 1950s, pioneered another model, which was so-called jointly operated playgrounds. So they didn't have more room to build more playgrounds, so they said, well, every place we have a school, they're going to need a playground, but we'll build it such that it can be used by the school during the school day and then by the neighborhood after school. And ultimately, there are about 275 or 280 what they call jointly operated playgrounds, meaning the school used them from 9 to 3 or 9 to 4, whatever the school day was. The community used them in the evenings, weekends, holidays, and so on, taken care of by the parks departments. And many of them had park houses, they had handball courts and basketball courts, some of them had asphalt playing fields. But the jointly operated playgrounds formed the backbone of the New York City playground system. It's probably close to half of the playgrounds. It also represents the JOPs, as we knew them in the Parks Department, represent the lion's share of parks in many communities, particularly places like Central Brooklyn and Harlem, where you don't have large parks. Brooklyn has 3 large parks, maybe 4, depends how you count. The rest are really playgrounds. So that Moses model was from 1934 to the late 1970s, when the new model begins, which is the adventure playground. And this new concept of the adventure playground supports my notion, I think others too, that New York City has always been a bellwether for park innovation. So the first municipal playground in America is invented right here at Seward Park. Then this idea of cookie cutter playgrounds with the basics, mostly words that begin with S: swings, seesaws, slides, spray showers, and then monkey bars. Those 4 or 5 basic elements that were replicable, made with really sturdy materials, cookie cutter playgrounds, went up by the hundreds. So that idea of those kinds of playgrounds spread across the country and around the world. And then you had this innovative new idea, kind of a reaction to the cookie cutter nature and the lack of any design elements in most of the playgrounds that Moses built.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like Noguchi was like a big Aldo Van Eck, Noguchi, and then Paul Friedberg came along,
Yeah.
and I think Datner built on top
Yes.
of all of that
You
stuff.
Friedberg and Datner building on the sort of Noguchi idea, and so this was a real flourishing moment of the adventure playgrounds where kids could do things that were a little bit more adventurous. You could swing on a rope from one pyramid to another. You could climb up ladders. There were tree houses. It turned out that even though these were really intriguingly designed, they were really difficult to take care of.
Yeah, I was going to ask about the maintenance of these, because these are custom made,
Yeah.
expensive. You know, you had Estee Lauder pay
Right.
for the first one, so you had how does like the Parks Department, especially like throughout the 70s and 80s, when you say it started to go in decline, like how do you maintain these and then
Well, it was very difficult because they're custom designed. Often they had wood in them and wood rots and splinters. So, they became quite dangerous. You know, if you had a rope and you're swinging into a concrete structure, you could fracture your skull. So we started to see that we were getting a lot of injuries in these playgrounds. And they were, frankly, in a brutalist style, so they're just big cast concrete forms that invited spray paint, so they got graffitied. And then the worst part was there were some that were structures. You could climb under them. It was very adventurous for kids. Like there are these pyramids. You go a little tunnel inside it. They say this room inside a pyramid. They became really disgusting really fast because homeless people went into them. People were defecating in them. They were shooting up. They were sleeping in them. So the city started sealing up. They couldn't have, a cave inside a playground. So by a certain point, I'd say by the mid-1980s, very quickly, the Parks Department had a very negative attitude about adventure playgrounds. And in fact, when I came in as a Manhattan Borough Commissioner, I had a capital projects coordinator who would look at an adventure playground and he would say, and I quote, "That's something to the effect of, that's a problem you can solve with 2 sticks of dynamite." And his idea was blow it up and start over, that they were irredeemable. So for a while, particularly outside of Central Park, the Parks Department was taking out the adventure playgrounds and replacing them with a new version of cookie cutter, which is the timber form, first the timber form play equipment, then the sort of modular playground equipment, the safety surfacing, the really safe swings, everything, the climbing units. And we had a new kind of a 1980s, 1990s version of the cookie cutter playground. It was like an update of the Moses cookie cutter, but with like interchangeable pre-made elements that had very little adventure. So there was this point where fans of modernist architecture, people who said, don't make all of our playgrounds so damn safe. And by the way, the safety thing was a response to getting sued. The city got sued all the time. There was kind of a standard, like, if you break your arm, the city will give you $40,000. We're not gonna fight this. Here's $40,000, bye. And there were a lot of $40,000 settlements for kids falling off adventure playground stuff and breaking their arms. So there was a very negative view. You couldn't maintain them. The wood forms are really difficult to replicate. But I think, fortunately, particularly for the better ones, the ones in Central Park, you had fans of modernist architecture like Doko Momo and others saying, wait a second, these are the works of important landscape architecture. We should save them. And I would also add that, the architects themselves saying, wait a second, are you sure you want to destroy my work? Let's make it safer. So you started to see an adaptive reuse of these designs. The biggest problem that we faced in doing that was there was AASHTO standards. So safety and engineering standards were being promulgated, several different kinds of national standards. And technically, these playgrounds, by their original designs, didn't meet any of the safety standards. So we had to come back in and retrofit them and with handrails and things that forced you to bend your head when you went down a slide, so you weren't going down standing up. So there was a period where adventure playgrounds where you had the time and money, were being retrofit to meet modern playground safety standards. American Society of Testing and Manufacturing had certain standards, and what was happening was that if somebody got hurt in the playground and it wasn't redesigned according to these new playground standards, you really stood a good chance of losing a lawsuit. Even if the kid had done something foolish, it's your fault because they didn't meet modern standards. So there was a lot of Bowdlerizing of adventure playgrounds. They were made less adventurous. That rope that you swung from one side to the other, that was taken out. No rope. So you climbed down off a thing, walked across the sand and climbed up. The other thing that happened was Friedberg and Datner didn't use rubber safety mats. For things you might fall off, they had beds of sand. Sounds reasonable. You know, it's probably may or may not meet current safety standards, but it got dirty and people would leave things behind. Again, animal waste, needles, broken glass. It was almost impossible to clean. You'd have to go in and sift and rake. So there was another moment particularly when parks were very expensive to maintain, where people were removing sand features and sandboxes. I literally drew a line in the sand as Manhattan Borough Commissioner. The commissioner said, we're not going to get rid of every sandbox. If we have to clean them, we clean them. It was my belief that children learned lots of different things in sandboxes, and that I also argued that there probably isn't a landscape architect practicing today who didn't start in the sandbox by shaping landforms. So there were many reasons to not bother to go through all the expense of retrofitting an old adventure playground. And then things evolved a little bit more, and it's like, okay, we now know how to take an old adventure playground and retrofit it to still have the same basic forms, but meet modern safety standards. Is it as adventurous as it once was? Probably not. Like that swinging rope, that's gone, because they don't want you're doing the George of the Jungle routine and smashing into the concrete thing, or breaking a leg because you land awkwardly. But the basic shapes of some of the adventure playgrounds can still be found, particularly and perhaps exclusively in the old adventure playgrounds of Central Park.
And sorry, I lost the train of thought.
Wait till you get it back. So, I had talked about how we were busy first raising the adventure playground, taking them down to the ground.
And when does then, you have not just Central Park, but a lot of parks struggling in the 70s, 80s, and when does the conservancy movement arise? And that obviously they play a big role in maintaining these as well.
So the city parks department, feeling they needed to take down, to demolish the adventure playgrounds, coincided with the beginning of the conservancy movement. And the Central Park Conservancy was born right around that time, in the early 1980s. So you suddenly had the capability of having an in-house design team at the Central Park Conservancy, which could look at this and say, yes, this is kind of historic fabric. Let's see how we can adaptively reuse it. And the Central Park Conservancy had then and still has its own, it has an in-house design unit with landscape architects. And they were willing to do the careful work it would take. So the interest in saving this period architecture, these modernist structures, coincided with the arrival of the Central Park Conservancy as a nonprofit partner with the sophistication to be able to retrofit an adventure playground. Because the city parks department eventually developed the ability to do that, but at first it was we got to get rid of this and start new and build a traditional, a new modern traditional playground, which is the prefabricated units.
And do you think that the idea of the Battle for Central Park was the beginning, the seed that led to Central Park Conservancy?
To a certain extent, the Battle for Central Park was led by Central Park West moms, by mothers involved with the community. In some cases, there were already advocates and activists. The Central Park Conservancy came from a slightly different point of view. Mm-hmm. I don't think Betsy Rogers, who was the founder of the Central Park Conservancy, was on the battlefield to save.
But there was a bunch of community groups.
But there were certainly there was the idea of community getting involved with saving the park has its roots in things like that. In say the women who battled to save Washington Square Park from having the entranceway to an expressway ran through it. So, and by the way, Jane Jacobs did not do that. No. Jane Jacobs is credited with doing a lot of stuff that other people did, and there was actually a mother's group that really saved Washington Square Park. It wasn't Jane Jacobs. Jane Jacobs was involved, but the prime actors were local neighborhood mothers.
Well, she was a celebrity, so like to have her there, it was like,
Yeah.
you know,
It was like getting, Jackie Onassis did not save Grand Central Station. She was drawn in, right?
They got Eleanor Roosevelt, right,
Yeah.
at some point.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So, but the fact that we still have at least the broad outlines of adventure playgrounds today in Central Park is due to the fact that you have the Central Park Conservancy with both the money and sophistication to retrofit and save those essential forms.
So how does the park department work with like a conservancy? Like is that like what you consider a public-private partnership?
Yes, so it's the relationship between the Central Park Conservancy is a public-private partnership. It's a formal partnership. It's defined by a management agreement that both parties sign, which basically the Conservancy agrees to do all the work of maintaining the park. And they also have, because they have a sophisticated design department, they can take city capital dollars and use them to rebuild the park. So it's not all private money. So there's a lot of public money that flows into the rebuilding of Central Park. The maintenance is almost fully paid for by the Park Conservancy with donations. But the capital projects to rebuild and to build and restore and rebuild the park are funded in part by public dollars and part by private. So the new swimming pool and skating rink complex at the north end, replacing the Lasper rink, is, I think, 50-50 split between public and private funding. But the difference is, unlike most parks, a nonprofit group is overseeing the construction projects that happen in the park.
And that, you know, Central Park Conservancy is well funded, you know, it's, you know, and how does like, you know, you take an example of like Battery Playscapes, which is another, you know, conservancy public-private partnership, and it's a great example of what a playground can be. So I think.
Well, there's two very similar cases. You have a strong, not lavishly funded, but well-funded organization that raises public and private money. Warry Price, who runs the Battery Conservancy, studied at the elbow of Betsy Barlow Rogers, and learned from her when she was living on the Upper East Side, and kind of an acolyte. So the Battery Conservancy is kind of like a smaller version of the Central Park Conservancy, and the exact same model. The difference being they don't have their own in-house designer, they hire outside landscape architects, but they basically oversee the projects.
Star Whitehead did a really good job with that, and you know, to compare what it was before to what it is now, and also how you don't really even see it from a certain angle, and you go in there and it opens up. It's so like, how can other like parks around the city that aren't well funded, that don't have conservancy, you know, is that obviously that's not a model for other parks, but how can it be like a roadmap for how you can improve playgrounds?
So I would say the average park or playground in New York City, those that are renovated, they do a pretty good job. There's the New York City Parks Department has one of the world's largest landscape architecture design build firms, right? They have hundreds of people who work at something called the Olmsted Center. Engineers, architects, landscape architects, construction supervisors, surveyors. They have a giant design build firm of hundreds of people, and they are probably doing $500 million of work every year. They're doing scores of playgrounds. Some of them are quite good, you know. So I think the difference is, and it's not just in-house landscape architects. They keep on call somewhere usually between 4 and 8, maybe 10 professional landscape architecture firms who are what they call on-call designers or design excellence designers. So some of the very best landscape architects in the country are designing playgrounds in New York City. They're not slouch playgrounds. They're very good playgrounds, and they're usually just updating either a 1930s or 1950s park design. So they're generally not redesigning an adventure playground. They're taking a kind of cruddy cookie cutter playground from the 30s, 40s, or 50s, or maybe even the 70s, and updating it. So it's almost always an improvement. Do they use the catalog items for play structures? Yes, but so does everybody else. And they're very well designed, they're very sturdy, they're powder coated with rust proof metals and things, and some of them are quite creative. So I think you're getting a lot of good play value, what you're not getting for the most part is a retrofit of an adventure playground. I was involved with one project as either Manhattan Borough Commissioner, I can't remember. There was an adventure playground on West 89th Street, just a standalone mid-block playground between Amsterdam and Columbus. And in that case, it was sort of a little side street lot. It was getting heavily vandalized. People were getting hurt in it, and we met with the neighbors. And it was a JOP, so the school used it. And they were like, "Yeah, get rid of this thing. Give us a new. They want a new playground, not this old thing that's dangerous and kids get hurt on."
Was that a Friedberg playground?
I believe it was a Friedberg playground. And I recall at the time thinking, and I knew Paul Friedberg was like, "I don't want to do this."
Yeah.
But I think it was most of the original structures were taken out and kind of a standard, modern updated.
Well, that's what I'm interested in exploring. Like I think, like in the '60s, you had this movement to where playgrounds became art.
Yeah.
Art influenced playgrounds, and
Yeah.
so the idea of that time, that period, and those playgrounds are still there to this day, but obviously through that response to the community keeping them there, because there was a lot of pressure not to have them there, as you talked about.
I would say that in many instances, the Parks Department would meet with the community and have a neighborhood group and what would you like to see here? Rarely, I think, did you ever have a group saying, keep this old pile of concrete here, we really love it. Though I do believe that the Friedberg playground at 89th Street, who's was a Saint something or other, I forget what the name was. I do believe there were some people in the neighborhood who said, we like this adventure playground, we're not worried about our kids getting hurt. And there's a battle, an intra-community battle over keep it, modernize it. I think because the Parks Department was in favor of modernizing it, i.e. getting rid of the old adventure design. Many of the parents were, even though there was a small group that wanted to keep it as it was, or mostly as it was, they did not prevail.
I can't think of any like I've only seen pictures, and I'd love to see them, but they're gone. But
I can't. You might have vestiges of adventure style playgrounds, as maybe here or there in an old city housing project. Certainly, the use of precast concrete play elements you'll still find in certain old NYCHA houses. But there was even just a year or two ago, there was this time where they were taking some of the older concrete play animals and getting rid of them.
Yeah.
So, anyway.
Yeah, there was at McLaurin Park, they got rid of the whale, and they did a great job with it, the playground, but the whale, this concrete whale was cool, and I don't know what happened to it. Maybe it'll end up.
Is that the one that was in Rockaway?
No, it was in Greenpoint.
It
was it might have been like a CPI park that got redone. But the CPI, I had a couple of videos talking about parks that were redone by the Community Parks Initiative, and that's a great example of taking, in both of the instances you talk about an asphalt playground, and making it much, obviously it was play structures, equipment, but it's improved just by adding the green.
Yeah, and that was the big difference, I think, for the beginning of the 1980s and 1990s, and really accelerating into the 21st century. Taking the typical asphalt playground and greening it up, really maximizing the green, planting beds all around it, bringing trees into the interior, putting green infrastructure elements so you could capture stormwater, and tilting the surfaces so they drained into those planting beds, which was great. And I think the best thing to come out of the new playground movement was environmentally productive playgrounds. And recirculating water, creating lots of natural shade,
using plants,
and this is something that was accelerated in the schoolyards to playgrounds program that Trust for Public Lands started 20 years ago, and which I helped play a role when I was working for the Trust for Public Land. And Trust for Public Land developed a new model of working with school playgrounds. These are not JOPs, playgrounds used specifically just by the schools belonging to the Department of Education, where we would come in and take an asphalt yard, basically an asphalt yard, not even any play equipment, turn it into a full-service playground, create stormwater capture systems, add play equipment, add a basketball court, add a running track, put in a soft surface playing field that could drain the stormwater, and then say, in exchange for us raising $1 million or $2 million to renovate your formerly awful schoolyard into a new playground, you must open it to the community after school. And that enabled the city to add a lot more neighborhood playgrounds to the mix, particularly during Plan YC. So Plan YC had as one of its centerpieces taking this Trust for Public Land model that was doing, say, 2 to 3 or 4 every year, and saying, we're going to do 200 of these conversions of asphalt schoolyards into community playgrounds, separate and apart from everything else we've talked about. This schoolyard to playground transformation process, which has now probably done 300 such transformations of asphalt schoolyards, which were never in the original count of 1,000 city playgrounds. These were on top of the 1,000 city playgrounds. So that was a really quick and really relatively inexpensive way. So that's another national model pioneered here. So this concept of green schoolyards or turning schoolyards into community playgrounds is also born in New York, is now something that's being used across the country, in part by the Trust for Public Land, but many places are saying we need joint use agreements. The only way we're going to maximize the amount of play space for kids is if we take these schoolyards, which are only used by the schools, and make them open to the communities, weekends, evenings, after school, and so on. So that was kind of like the final and latest playground innovation in New York City, was the transformation of single-purpose asphalt schoolyards into multi-purpose green, beautiful community playgrounds.
In every scenario I've seen where that's happened, I've seen it improve.
Oh yeah.
The usage and the quality and the people there and the demographics, everything is much more used, and it's a different place.
Yeah, there's one here in Brooklyn, I think it's PS 261, I could have the number wrong. It's on Pacific Street, and it was one of the early ones. And it was just a big empty asphalt area, and we made it into a really nice playground with a running track and a soft surface playing field. And suddenly on weekends it was full of kids and parents. And I went there one weekend, and there must have been 200 people in there, in something that ordinarily would have been locked up and empty on a weekend. And I said to one of the parents there, Mom, said, you know, you've got these neighborhood parks, playgrounds all around you, why aren't you there instead of here? I said, well, this is our quad. This is where kids play every day. It's safe, it belongs to us. And so, you know, that model, that was a transformative model, and it's still going on. The Trust for Public Land is still doing this, and the interesting thing there is it's also a public-private partnership where they can come in and do in a year or a year and a half a project would take the city 3 years to do at a third of the cost. So they do it in a third of the time and a third of the cost. So that's, and because they're so successful, city council members are funneling money to them saying, hey, please do my neighborhood playground, because I know I'll actually get to cut a ribbon on this during my first term in office. I won't have to wait 6 years.
And so that, I think I have 2 more questions.
Yeah.
And then I just lost my train of thought also, but one important question is, what is play?
So, you know, it's funny, what is play? Both myself, me, growing up here in New York City, and my sons, raising my kids in New York City, I realized that very little of the play that we did took place using play equipment in the way in which it was intended. So Exhibit A is, or Example A was when I was a kid in 97th Street Playground. Because it had 2 levels, along the side of one of the staircases was just kind of what would have been a planted area between the staircase and the fence. But for whatever reason, it became basically just bare dirt. And me and my buddies would take whatever, a spoon or playground shovel or something, and we'd dig trenches going down this gradually sloping hill next to the staircase. And we'd make a reservoir at the top, and it was right near a drinking fountain. We'd get whatever, some cups or buckets, and fill the reservoir with water and make a dam, and then break the dam so the water would spill down the spillway that we'd make. That was really fun. You know, we were like baby landscape architects learning how water flows through landforms and stuff. And I remember the grouchy old guy who worked in the park house would come in, hey, you kids, stop messing up my park, you know.
Yeah.
So we'd run away, and as soon as he went back in to drink or nap, we'd keep digging our ditches. So, you know, or the informal games you'd play, the hunt and catch, hide and seek games that you'd play that had nothing to do with the play equipment. That was A. B, when my kids were growing up, their favorite game in the playground was called Daddy Monster, where basically I would be the monster, and they and their friends would be the people running away and screaming from the monster, and I was trying to catch them. Again,
They call that chase, daddy chase.
Daddy chased me, whatever. So again, Yes, you'd go up and down the play equipment, but you weren't going up and down the play equipment for the sake. You were using it as a point of escape.
Yeah.
But my happiest memories of play with my kids were just walking around Riverside Park, but particularly Central Park, because you had all those great rocks to climb on. And you go to the park. You might bring some sports equipment, but maybe not. You might have a soccer ball, but you just wander around the park. The kids would pick up sticks. They'd find seed pods from sweet gum trees, or nuts from the trees, horse chestnuts. They'd climb the rocks. We'd build forts. We'd take twigs and build villages and stuff. So outdoors, playing in nature, climbing, exploring, picking up sticks, building nests for birds. That kind of play, informal nature play, I think was the best kind of play. So, play is really the interaction of children with other children or adults with children. And often that interaction is not dependent on a playground. It's dependent, but it is dependent on having open space that feels clean and safe. You don't, and you want to make sure people have picked up after the dogs. I have a terrible memory of rolling down a hill very happily in Central Park and rolling through dog waste. Stunk and was full of, I had to go home and change. It was just sort of mortifying, but because that was in the days before you were supposed to pick up after your dogs. So play is really what happens largely between children and other children and children and adults. It could also be between adults. You see adults playing games out in the landscape, but you really need the outdoor spaces for play, and whether they're heavily programmed and designed, or I think having lots of unprogrammed outdoor spaces in which to play other kinds of games. Like I went to the park recently, Riverside Park. There's an after-school program where they're playing like Capture the Flag or something, or some classic kids game, which depended on landscape to roam around it. Or during the pandemic, there was a mom and her 3 kids up in the bird sanctuary, and they were building forts out of branches they found, in the landscape. So, this Richard Louv and this whole idea of nature play and the necessity of unstructured play in nature. He calls it "No Child Left Indoors."